Day 1296 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 1,092,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 890 in the past day. Then as for hardware, 1 tank, 2 APVs, 40 artillery, 2 of the separately classed artillery rocket launchers, and another successful strike on one of Russia's fully fledged Lukoil depots. Then to take a very brief look at the territory of control stats, with Russia's total occupying portfolio of Ukraine currently at 19.01%, remaining stationary for the last 1 or 2 weeks, which serves as a reminder of how Russians have advanced less than 1% in Ukraine within a 1,000-day time span, and paying an unimaginable price for it. It's almost as if Russia is holding out on the hope that the battlefield dynamic will somehow, all of a sudden, decisively swing to their unquestionable advantage, even as we see quite a consistent linear degradation in the quality of their army's hardware and personnel. Now to the map, as Russia awoke to one of the broadest drone assaults of the war, with swarms reported to be moving simultaneously towards Moscow, St. Petersburg, Smolensk, and Rostov and Crimea, with Russian monitoring channels describing the scale of the drone incursion headed north as without precedent. For starters, these kinetic sanctions were being implemented in a strike that has hit Pokrovsk, Russia's largest oil loading port at the Baltic Sea, sparking a fire and rattling one of Moscow's most critical energy gateways. The region's governor, Drozdenko, confirmed that the attack set a vessel ablaze inside the terminal complex, though Russian channels initially offered conflicting accounts, some calling it a ship, others an oil loading point itself, but where later reports into the day suggest the strike set fires on a vessel inside the terminal and at a pumping station, forcing oil loading to halt. Analysts say the pause alone could cost Russia as much as $41 million per day in lost export revenues of its shadow fleet. And it's really a place where Pokrovsk's significance cannot be overstated. It is the main export hub for crude from Russia's Druzhba pipeline system, designed for funneling millions of tons annually to international markets. Following these overnight events, a Ukrainian drone strike set on fire a Lukoil oil depot in the Smolensk region, hitting tanks in the settlement of Kardimovo on the northwestern outskirts of the city. The depot took at least 2 direct hits, according to earlier accounts. Fires were reported across the site, with Russian outlets acknowledging damage at the tank farm. The scale of destruction and disruption to operations is still being assessed, but this location's own past tells an interesting story, as this oil storage and distribution facility has been targeted previously in the spring of last year, when only 2 out of 16 oil tanks survived a massive fire. So coming to now, this suggests a reoccurring pattern for the AFU. Facilities are subsequently targeted again and again after their restoration is complete, keeping them from ever returning to stable operation, with Russia now engaged in an ever-deepening and costly exercise in futility. Now to the Vovchansk sector, or just slightly to the north, with reports of Ukraine's defense forces using an FPV drone and mines planted under the structure seen here to blow up a bridge in Nova Tavolzanka. This type of activity directly impedes Russian resupply and maneuver options in the border zone north of Vovchansk, which in turn forces Moscow to reroute logistics through fewer, more predictable crossings, increasing Ukrainian opportunities for interdiction, rendering it more difficult for Russia to move supplies and troops to support their Vovchansk offensives. Now to occupied Luhansk, where the night sky was lit up as Ukrainian drones reportedly struck a Russian ammunition depot. The attack triggered a powerful blast, with witnesses describing a rising mushroom cloud above the site. Russian logistics in the region have long relied on forward-stored depots inside Luhansk, where stockpiles feed artillery batteries along the eastern front. Targeting of such facilities forces Moscow into a costly cycle of moving supplies deeper to the rear, lengthening transport routes, and thinning the reliability of frontline resupply. It leaves Russian units more exposed to delays, shortages, and overall disruption. No supply, no dog repeller. And speaking of, headed into the centralized and evolving sector, where it appears to show that Russia's much touted advance is collapsing into a trap. Only about 450 meters or 1,300 feet of contested ground remain before Ukrainian forces seal the pocket, leaving Russian units close to full encirclement. Ukraine has retaken varying degrees of additional ground at Mayak and Pankivka, cutting the last clean routes to the rear. Pressure from Nakhanarivka squeezes from the north, while fights around Boykivka show Moscow's troops trying frantic counterattacks with little effect. The situation resembles a textbook squeeze and a double-axis squeeze at these 2 points on the map, with Russian exits closing, supply lines under immense pressure, and the space for maneuver shrinking with every push. Unless the Russian elements break out soon, and if the AFU continues to play its cards well, then the Dobrapilla salient may go down as one of their most costly Russian failures of 2025, certainly one of the most ill-famed or notorious. And then on this topic of these recent difficulties faced by the Russian army, and for another Russian doom posting segment, Russia's own war bloggers are beginning to accuse the Kremlin of waging a public relations campaign rather than a war. In a widely shared post, blogger Anatoly Radov described commanders falsifying victories, inventing advances, and drowning out the reality that Ukrainian drones dominate the skies. Radov argues that the obsession with declaring success has become systemic. Reports from the front about Ukraine's overwhelming advantage in FPV drones are dismissed by what he calls armchair critics on Russia's side, who insist on accusing soldiers and bloggers of exaggerating difficulties. He also notes that even basic efforts to acquire funds for gathering equipment for UAVs, repeaters, and electronic warfare equipment is being sabotaged, with Russian banks blocking cards, Duma officials restricting appeals, and platforms like Discord and Starlink cut off in occupied areas, meaning that, even if these types of requests could be facilitated, there's still no way for desperate units to send them out. The result, he writes, is battlefield failures, costly assaults in grey zones where 2 soldiers are sent forward, then eliminated under Ukrainian fire, but their loss then repackaged as advances on the map, where he used the examples of Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, and others, and calling them unfinished battles, with little to show for months of bloodshed. Radov's conclusion is blunt. If Russia continues this charade of paper victories, the war will drift toward a frozen conflict that is instead dictated by Ukraine and the West. Then, meanwhile, on the map, headed south to the Tolstoy direction, but a location Russian forces are in fact making their presence felt, with an extension of their units pushing out narrowly northwest to take some further ground, up to the various river belts, including the Vovcha River, which is in fact somewhat reminiscent of their previous movements, slightly north of the Tolstoy direction, pushing up to the river boundaries, where their earlier activity culminated in a series of stallouts. Next on the map, and now to the Russian exclave region of Kaliningrad. And take this update with a grain of salt, but there's been word of a Ukrainian retaliatory strike onto Russia from its west into Kaliningrad. This is improbable, yet the idea itself captures the imagination, as it would essentially flip the map upside down. For Ukraine to attempt such an operation, it would almost certainly require Poland's approval and cooperation, its airspace serving as the launchpad. But for Moscow, it would be a nightmare of asymmetry in warfare. Russia would face the dilemma of responding through Polish skies, meaning NATO skies, while Kaliningrad itself is poorly equipped to project meaningful power back into Ukraine. Now the question might be, is there any tactical logic for Ukraine to hit Kaliningrad? Hypothetically, yes, though the reasoning is a bit more indirect. Kaliningrad is a very dense Russian air defense hub. Disabling batteries there would force Moscow to redeploy defenses from the mainland, stretching its protection of the main territory and its special military operation. But then there's also the matter of logistics. Though geographically cut off, Kaliningrad relies on rail and sea resupply. Hitting depots, fuel sites, or rail links could complicate the stationing and and sustainment of Russian forces, forcing Moscow into a constant struggle to keep the exclave running, undermining its ability to host or launch major operations from there. Then comes the psychological and political dimension. Ukraine, demonstrating it can hit even Russia's most fortified western outpost, would puncture Moscow's image of control. But realistically, for Ukraine to engage in these such strikes, it's a case of the risks would be significant. Risking Russian retaliation through Polish airspace, though an argument could be made for Lithuania as well, potentially leading to a broader Russia-European conflict. So although Kaliningrad's small size and proximity do make it a tempting and vulnerable target, limited in resources to mount serious counterstrikes, it would mean that engagements like these outplanned between Ukraine and Russia on this new frontier would invert the David and Goliath roles, with Ukraine turning into Goliath against Russia's most isolated David, making for untold amounts of irony here. So in short, there are several reasons Ukraine might consider striking Kaliningrad: tactical, logistical, and psychological, but they're all tightly bound up with political red lines and the spectre of a NATO escalation. Oddly enough, the karmic boomerang effect has actually already been felt by Russia, following its sending of 20-odd drones into Polish airspace 2 days ago, as Russian monitoring channels have put out a notice to warn about the potential of a huge number of UAVs flying toward Kaliningrad through Poland or the Baltics. What a surprising and newly unfolding dynamic we might never have guessed to question. Then to the news, taking it rapid fire with NATO's Article 4 consultation meeting yesterday, which has condemned the Russian drone incursions as a serious violation of Allied airspace, and in response are rapidly deploying additional air policing and counter-drone assets to Poland's eastern flank. Germany announced an expansion of its air defense contributions, including extended patrols over Polish airspace, while intensifying Ukrainian aid. The Netherlands, Italy, France, and the UK have pledged fighter jets, radar systems, and anti-drone tech, with France deploying 3 Rafale jets specifically in response. There's also a follow-up UN Security Council session today, which addresses the drone incursions into Polish airspace, but the outcome is fairly predictable, with the Russian delegation quite likely to take the same position as always. One of complete and utter denial of any wrongdoing, and a mixed bag of convoluted lies, and I can virtually guarantee it, calling Europe aggressive and overall framing them as a militaristic and hostile entity looking for war. But could anybody possibly believe that? Then to related news, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, responding to the Russian drone incursions, announced cooperation with Ukraine on counter-drone development, warning, quote, "Anyone who attacks Poland will inevitably face the appropriate punishment," end quote. Warsaw will send military representatives into Ukraine for hands-on training, while Kyiv has expanded the effort by offering a joint interceptor drone production with other European partners. Britain has already joined, committing to co-develop and mass-produce Project Octopus drones with Ukraine. Officials expect output in the thousands per month, each unit costing about roughly 1/10 the price of a standard Russian Shahed drone, allowing Ukraine to field 10 interceptors for the cost of 1 attack. These and additional efforts shaping up signals a broader European shift towards collective drone defense manufacturing rather than fragmented national buys. So the Kremlin wanted to use these drone incursion events from 2 days ago as a means to, at least in part, project power and an image of strength further into the West. But it's not without its own backfire, as Moscow's gambit is certainly triggering European defense acceleration. What a can of worms it's opened. Difficult to put the lid back on that one. Then to round out the video with a quick funny, because this headline appears just as pure comedy, because a Russian chain of stores dubbed Army in Russia is reportedly closing down. This chain deals in military apparel of both a tactical and civilian nature, and the company is linked with the Russian Ministry of Defense through contracts to supply the Russian military with uniforms, gear, and related equipment. But now the brand's operator cited a decline in sales leading to the store's closure. So, as it turns out, the sales slump was really making this chain lose an arm and a leg. I'm trying not to laugh there, but This is also really quite perplexing, given that certain segments of Russia's economy are booming, where it comes to funeral services, which we've seen a lot of before, and surely, especially for these types of stores, because after all, contract soldiers have to purchase their own equipment with their SMO sign-up bonuses. So almost none of this makes sense. Except, of course, when you consider corruption might be playing a part, with tens of billions being siphoned out of the Russian economy to offshore jurisdictions as safe havens for oligarchs. So just another day in Mother Russia, where even the people profiting from the SMO apparently can't afford to stay in business. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, all of those wonderful things for the channel, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!